Thanks, everyone, for joining this presentation of the International Community of the Society of Professional Journalists. My name is David Carlson. I'm a retired journalist and emeritus professor at the University of Florida. I was national president of the SPJ in 2005-06 and traveled widely in Korea during the early 2000s, but sadly I have not been back now in several years. Well, this is an IC talk sponsored by the International Community of the SPJ. That international community is a group of journalists that encourage press freedom globally. We use these one-on-one conversations to dig a little deeper into issues affecting journalists around the world. Sometimes it's about press freedom and threats to independent journalists. Other times, other topics. We hope you learn and grow and take from today information that will help and inspire you in your work going forward. The format is simple. The guests and I will have a conversation. I encourage you to ask questions as the discussion goes on. To do that, please use the Q&A feature. If you want me to read the question for you, please indicate that in the question. Otherwise, the co-chair of the international community, Dan Kubisky, will unmute your microphone so that you can ask our guest directly. Please be short and concise. We want to give as many people as possible a chance to ask questions. Please reserve the chat feature to communicate with Dan, who is our technical guru. If you have any technical questions or want more information about the international community or SPJ, you can chat with Dan about that as the discussion goes along. We are recording this session and we will be placing it on our YouTube channel so that people who could not be here today will be able to learn from our guests. And now I would like to introduce those guests. William Gallo is the Voice of America Seoul Bureau Chief and Regional Correspondent. His main focus is U.S. policy in Northeast Asia. Prior to coming to Seoul, William covered U.S. foreign policy and international affairs for the Voice of America at the White House, Pentagon, and State Department. He has covered the Trump-Kim summits in Vietnam and Singapore, the Trump-Putin summit in Finland, and traveled throughout South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East as part of the Pentagon Press Corps. Scott Griffen, our other guest, is the Deputy Director for the International Press Institute based in Paris, France. He joined the International Press Institute in 2012 as Press Freedom Advisor, focusing on Latin America and the Caribbean. As Deputy Director, he helps manage IPI's long-term project work and press freedom advocacy. And he oversees IPI's external and internal communications. He holds a bachelor's degree in humanities from Yale University and a master's degree in global ethics from King's College London. So let's get to it, guys. It's a pleasure having you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
So I'd like to ask you to begin with how you came to what you're doing these days. So if you would tell us, William, what led you to become a journalist?
Well, I didn't actually study strictly journalism. I studied communications. I graduated in 2007, and after that, the economy was not great. I worked in local media for a while, and then decided to go teach English with my wife in Cairo, Egypt. I did a little freelance journalism there, but not much. It was actually right as the Arab Spring happened, and that wasn't really sort of our battle to stick around. I was still a journalist with very little experience. So I moved back to Washington, D.C., where I eventually got on with the Voice of America in 2012. You heard the introduction there. I've done quite VOA provides a lot of opportunities, I think even for young journalists, and I sort of learned the ropes there. In 2019, I was able to get this job in Seoul, and it's really been an ideal place to be for many reasons. Obviously, the diplomacy with North Korea, but really South Korea is just interesting on its own now, right? I think that for many reasons, people are talking about it. But during the pandemic, especially, it's been a real model for how countries can handle the pandemic. So I've been here 2.5 years, hope to stay a bit longer, but yeah, that's sort of how I got here.
Thank you very much. And what about you, Mr. Griffen? What led you to take up the mantle of defending journalists?
Thanks, David. A small correction, actually. IPI is based in Vienna, not in Paris.
Sorry.
Which is no problem. Which is relevant because I came to Vienna originally on a Fulbright grant and ended up starting to work at IPI about 8 years ago. Basically out of a personal conviction of the importance of press freedom, and originally focusing on Latin America, which was what where my expertise was more at the time. And it's become I've had an incredible experience over the past 8 years working on a range of issues around the world, and I think now is such a critical moment for press freedom and for independent journalism. We really are seeing a global trend towards restricted space for media. We see rising authoritarianism. We see rising physical attacks on journalists, rising attempts to control the press in different ways. So it's a really important time to be in this field and to be fighting this fight. And unfortunately, there are so many different fronts for that, and I'm sure we'll speak about that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Well, William, can you please give us a quick sort of overview of what's going on in South Korea? We're actually here to discuss a pretty serious situation. So can you run down for us this law and where it came from?
Right. So South Korea's ruling Democratic Party proposed earlier this year a revision to the Press Arbitration Act. Essentially, what that means is under this law, courts here in South Korea would be able to dramatically increase the punishment for media organizations that intentionally publish false information. Of course, the definition of what does intentionally publish false information mean is very important. The fact is, the stipulation, that part of the proposal was very vague. There were concerns that it could be arbitrarily implemented. There were concerns, of course, that it could have a chilling effect, lead to self-censorship. And so that was the proposal. It was very, very strongly sort of defended by the ruling party here for very many months. There was a period of international outcry about this bill. It was very strong, and South Korea does actually pay attention very much, of course, to its international reputation. It has a very good international reputation, and it guards it very carefully. So as of about a month or two ago, this bill was actually temporarily shelved. Basically, they formed a committee made up of the opposition party and the ruling party to study and offer recommendations on this bill. But everyone knows that both sides very much disagree. This appears to be sort of a way to sort of make it go away for now, anyway.
Mm-hmm. So how does a proposal like this come up? Actually, no, let's go a different direction first, if you don't mind. Let's talk for a second about the notion of fake news. I think people in America certainly believe that is a term that was essentially invented by Donald Trump, and certainly has had an effect here in the U.S. So my question for you two is, do you see these kinds of laws popping up all over the place or not? Maybe you could start, Scott.
Sure. The short answer to your question is yes. We do see these so-called fake news laws or anti-disinformation laws sometimes. They're called popping up in a number of countries around the world. And in particular, since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, that we saw a number of states, mostly authoritarian states or states with repressive regimes, introducing fake news laws to control information about the pandemic in many cases. But the problem is, as was referred to earlier, that fake news can mean one thing, obviously, to one person and another thing to another. And when you put this type of concept into the hands of a state that is already hostile to press freedom or freedom of information, you can only imagine how this term might be twisted into something that serves the government rather than serves the public. And that is indeed what we saw. If you look at the countries that introduced these types of laws, Russia, for example, or even Hungary was considering these types of laws. We saw a number of Southeast Asian countries looking at fake news laws. And the problem is not only how they may be used in the short term. Some of them, as I said, were focused on disinformation in the state's eyes related to the pandemic, but how they may morph in the future to be used to target other types of material or other types of reporting that isn't favorable to the state. So this is really our concern if you look at a global level. And I think that in general, you mentioned the fact that this is a term that was, popularized at least by Trump. I think that we should be careful not to parrot that type of language. It's terminology and concepts that can be easily abused when in the wrong hands, and I'm not sure that it does the cause of press freedom good for ourselves to be calling other types of information fake news. We know there is a problem with disinformation, but I think that we ourselves should be careful in the way that we talk about this. This is why IPI ourselves, and normally we put the term fake news in quotes, because we're careful about borrowing this type of terminology from people like Trump, who wielded it as a tool against uncomfortable information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting too that South Korea is not one of the countries you mentioned that does not have press freedom. It is a democratic country. It ranked, I believe, in the what ranking was it? It was 44th in. I forget which ranking it was, but I mean, it's considered, is widely considered among, if not the freest Asian country as far as free speech. And yet you see this proposal popping up here. I think that was really one of the most notable things, was that this is South Korea doing this. My gosh. So I think that the idea of fake news, as Scott said, is really providing justification for many governments to do perhaps what they already wanted to do. And maybe that was sort of the case here in South Korea as well.
Yeah, if I could just follow up on that. I mean, I think that obviously we certainly wouldn't consider South Korea to be a non-democratic country. It clearly has a high level of democratic governments and the rule of law, which in a way made this bill, in our view, even more problematic because it would serve as a cue to governments with a much lower level of democracy, with a much lower level of the rule of law, that if this type of legislation and these types of structures can be built in democratic countries, then certainly they can be imposed in non-democratic countries. So this sort of example setting or scene setting is something that we have to take into account, and it's one of the reasons why we pushed back strongly against this proposed law.
Well, speaking of that, the situation, can you describe for us, William, what was going on in South Korea that caused this bill to be proposed?
Mm-hmm. Well, South Korea obviously has a very complicated history as far as it's a new democracy. It really only became a democracy in the 1980s, in the late 1980s. And you saw a lot of reforms happen since then. You did not see, however, large media companies, which were controlled by major conglomerations in South Korea, many of them. You didn't see them make the same reforms. So what you have are big newspapers, the biggest newspapers in South Korea, controlled by major business interests that did not really see it in their interest to sort of ensure free speech in so many ways. Many of those newspapers are conservative. Many of the biggest newspapers in South Korea are conservative. Not every newspaper in South Korea is conservative, but sort of the biggest ones are. And this has always been something very upsetting for South Korea's liberals. the fact that these big newspapers don't necessarily have the highest editorial standards, and the fact that they lean conservative. So this is sort of a long-standing goal, I think, for South Korea's liberals who are currently in charge. I think they saw this as a situation to finally do something about it. And just to give you kind of a taste of what things look like here, because I know I'm talking sort of in the abstract, we're currently in a presidential election season here in South Korea. There's an election coming up in March. The state of the media has ensured that basically in South Korea, issues are not discussed at all. A new scandal pops up virtually every day. It is incredibly thinly sourced. It is very salacious. It is very hard to tell what is true and what is not. It's to the point where the main story in the news a couple of weeks ago was about the conservative presidential candidate here, whether or not he had links to an anal acupuncturist. You ask, what's an anal acupuncturist? I don't really know. I had to look it up. And that came up in the context of a discussion of whether he had links to shamanistic, mystics and things like this who claim to travel between dimensions. It is incredibly shallow. And I say this with all due respect for my South Korean colleagues. I do not blame them. They are among the most hardworking journalists I have ever met. I have immense respect for them, and nothing I say really should be construed as an attack on them. But they're operating within a system that has severe flaws. And some of the biggest newspaper outlets in South Korea consistently report things which are, frankly, irresponsible and sort of out of line with global media standards.
Well, that's very interesting. In my travels in South Korea, I did notice some of that. And in fact, you could have, on any given day, you might have virtually opposite headlines from one newspaper to another, especially in and around Seoul.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, it's not that there are not also, liberal leaning papers. In fact, the previous president, Park Geun-hye, was brought down and impeached in 2017, in large part because of investigations from sort of left leaning newspapers. It really did uncover wrongdoing. So it's not as if it's only, the conservatives control all media here, but still it's something that sort of has been a long-term goal for many liberals here to sort of deal with this issue. They have a super majority in parliament now. So they figured, well, this is our time maybe to do something about it. But it seemed to be really, really misguided in the way they actually went about it.
Well, I think we briefly discussed where this bill sits now, but perhaps we could discuss it in a little more detail. And actually, I'm interested in why the bill was sort of sidelined. My understanding is it went to sort of a negotiation committee to refine it, if you will.
Yes, that's correct. So it's basically sitting in a committee right now in Parliament here until the end of the year. It's not really being discussed very much now. I think journalists are still very concerned. Virtually, no, in fact, every journalist I talked to for the story, and it was a lot of journalists I spoke with, they were opposed to this and they continue to be worried about it. But the chances of this actually happening now are much reduced since this was sort of put on hold. It was basically a polite way to say, well, we're not going to take the risk and actually pass this law, even though we could right now, especially ahead of the presidential election. I think it would be too much risk. But I really would like to say here, and this is not to toot the horn of people like yourself and Scott too much, but the international backlash to this was widely credited for putting this on pause. Especially, I can say the very, very firm statement from Irene Khan, who is the UN Special Rapporteur for freedom of expression. It was a statement I haven't really seen in relation to any country. I mean, she was incredibly blunt about the dangers of this law, and I think that had something to do with why it's being paused for right now.
Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in the reasons behind the sort of yellow journalism that you're describing in South Korea. Is the idea, is the reason behind that to sell more papers or to push the political point of view or some combination of those things?
I think that like any country, South Korea has experienced sort of a shattering of the information sphere, right? With social media and sort of all the traditional gatekeepers gone. That's certainly part of it. I mean, there's no question about it. YouTube is a major source of disinformation, especially over the last 5 years. A lot of older people have taken to YouTube and done streams like that. That actually, there's a lot of disinformation there. But there are really specific reasons that it's happening this way in South Korea as well. One of the main reasons that was not even going to be addressed by this law was the role of these web portals. If you're thinking of an international context, sort of think of Google News or Yahoo News. This is the way that the majority of South Koreans actually get their news content, is from logging onto opening their cell phones and seeing either Naver or Dom are these two major news portals. And these news portals pull articles from South Korean media. Basically, they act as editors. And whenever South Korean news consumers click on these articles, it's not even clear all the time where these news articles are from, especially for more low information consumers. This creates a sort of really perverse incentive all around, frankly. It provides incentive for journalists and media outlets to produce articles that will be snatched up by Naver because and this other news portal, which are these news outlets' main source of clicks. If they don't get picked up by these portals, they won't be seen. And so, a lot of the stuff you see on there is highly questionable. It's just rumors. It's stuff they picked up from a bulletin board. And so a lot of it is not just politically divisive. A lot of it's just shallow and thinly sourced, to be honest.
Scott, have we seen international pressure work to blunt these sort of attacks or news legislation elsewhere?
Yes, of course. I mean, international pressure has impacted it in a lot of cases. I agree that in this case, it definitely had an impact, and I agree the statement of Irene Khan was an important one. And it wasn't just IPI, but a number of press freedom organizations spoke out against this bill. Other human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, for example. So it was widely criticized by human rights organizations. And maybe just to say something briefly about why we oppose this bill. Mm-hmm. And I think it's our job is to look at the context and understand the possible impact that legislation like this can have, and that is the case even when there may be an underlying problem, and it may be the case. I'm not an expert on South Korean media, but it may well be the case that there is an issue with yellow journalism or journalism that is based on rumors. And there may be an issue with disinformation, but our job is to look at whether the legislation proposed would actually have a negative impact that goes far beyond that goal. And in our view, there was a risk, as was mentioned by William before, of a chilling effect on quality journalism, on investigative journalism. And that was particularly because the bill itself made use of very vague terms in terms of who could possibly be liable to pay damages under this law and what actions could be liable. So, damaging people's reputation, etc., or inflicting psychological distress, I believe, some terminology like this, which are all vague, sort of fairly vague circumstances that would be up to a court or a judge to decide on. And the other issue was the fact that the fines that were foreseen under this law were very high. So punitive damages up to 5 times the amount of actual damage caused by the newspaper report. And when you look at it that way, you can see that there would have been a big risk that even quality media, quality journalists, there would be a risk that they say, look, these are serious amounts of fines that we're talking about here that we could potentially be liable for. We publish a story, it's based on an investigation, and someone takes us to court, and there's a judge who needs to decide whether we published news that is verified or not. And these are all issues that can be very difficult to determine. And so you can imagine, I think, that some people, some editors, some journalists may think twice about their work. And this is exactly the type of development that could come from this type of law, would cause so much concern to us. So we need to think about, and that's the way that we approach these types of issues when they arise. It's not just, is there an issue on the ground, and what is the government trying to do, but what could be the foreseen or unforeseen consequences of these types of laws. And I think, again, we saw the potential for systemic risk to journalism. And this was echoed very much by, as was already mentioned, there was a unanimous rejection of this bill by the journalistic community in South Korea. And I think that says a lot about it. And I think that also, we pushed hard for the journalistic community to be involved in discussions about this bill. If you introduce a law that has potentially a big impact on the way that journalists do their jobs, you need to have the media community involved in those discussions, because they are the ones who will be impacted by it. So I think we were also concerned that was not happening. And that was one of our major asks, that you need to involve the experts in these discussions. Otherwise, it doesn't have credibility. It looks like, that there's more of a political angle behind it if you don't have all of the necessary stakeholders involved. So that's sort of how we approach this bill and why we took such a critical line towards it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. I mean, like I mentioned, every South Korean journalist I talked to acknowledged there was a problem, but also way more forcefully said this is not the way to fix it. This will only cause more societal problems. And even some of the big journalist unions, who are very sympathetic to like the liberal side of South Koreans' political spectrum that actually proposed this bill, those organizations were very strongly against this bill. And you even saw many ruling party lawmakers come out against it. This was not the way to fix the problem. I think virtually everyone, except for a very small group of people in South Korea, now realize that.
Was there a part of this proposal or a feature in the proposal that would actually kind of change the amount of damages based on the size of the news organization?
Yeah, there was some aspects of that. I can't speak completely, in depth about that, but it did increase the amount of punishments, punitive damages, by 5 times the estimated damage. There was also some type of measurement in this. Maybe Scott could speak more specifically to this, that actually was, estimating those damages based on the reach of the media outlet. But a main concern here is also that smaller media outlets would not be able to sort of afford some of these punitive damages either, that some of these bigger outlets may be able to eventually sort of, come to terms with something like this, but it would maybe have also a bigger impact on some of the smaller organizations as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that this goes to the heart of the uncertainty that would be introduced by this law. I don't know the details of whether there was a clause that foresaw that, depending on the media's financial situation, the fines would be higher or lower, but in principle, it would have introduced a 5 times increase in punitive damages. But I think that the point is that, if you are someone who were the target of a media investigation, let's say about corruption or some other form of wrongdoing, there's nothing to stop you from bringing a case to court. And if you're the media outlet that published this, let's say even if it's completely, your investigation was well-founded, based on facts, there's always going to be a little bit of uncertainty about the outcome of any kind of court case or court procedure. And if you're talking about a small amount of money, you may be able to live with that uncertainty. If you're talking about an amount of money that could bankrupt your media organization, and that goes back to the large fines, large amount of fines that were foreseen, then it's a completely different story, because then you're talking about, okay, what would happen if we lose this case? And again, I think that's the issue that we saw, that because there was so much uncertainty about the terminology, about what the law was trying to do, because there was so much uncertainty about the potential financial damage to the media, that there would be this risk of a chilling effect. And this is nothing new. We see these types of chilling effects around the world. So it does exist. And again, this uncertainty is what led us to reject the bill in this form.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you both, beginning with William. Can you describe the I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought here for a second. What I was trying to get at is the journalism organizations in Korea. Can you describe that a little bit? You mentioned unions. Is that what they are, or are they more like independent organizations that try to further the cause of journalism and so on?
Oh, there are plenty of independent journalists here, and there are a lot of journalist unions also. But really, no matter who they were against this law. The whole spectrum of South Korean journalists, even ones that were sympathetic to the Moon administration, which had made this proposal, were very much against it, and for the reasons that Scott's saying. I mean, this stuff was very, very vague. What is false information? We don't even know what false information is. What does it mean to intentionally spread it? We don't know what that means. I mean, and some of the problems I mentioned with South Korean journalism and media, well, I mean, sure, it's a problem, but to have like highly divisive rhetoric, but does that fall under false information? Does satire fall under false information? I mean, there were real concerns that not only would there be a chilling effect, that this could actually really just change, like severely limit the ability to be able to discuss things in the way they've been discussed until now in South Korea.
Do you feel there is a way that free speech can be protected while trying to stamp out intentional misinformation?
Scott?
Is that one for me? Well, that's I think that's the question, isn't it? I haven't seen a disinformation law that convinces me that would be the perfect model. I think that in many cases there are existing laws and existing concepts within laws that allow for people who are targeted with disinformation to bring media, to uphold their rights in court. If you look at defamation laws, for example, if your reputation has been harmed, you absolutely have the right to go to court and correct and protect that right, and hold also media accountable for damaging your reputation. There are good and bad ways in our view of doing that. A bad way is criminal defamation laws, which are still in the books in South Korea. A better way are civil defamation laws that that result in civil damages and that have enough protections for media freedom. But a lot of fake news is about harming people's reputation, for example. So there exist those types of laws. If it's about speech that damages, that is discriminatory or that is targeted at certain segments of the population, some countries have so-called hate speech laws on the books that can also be used in this way. So I think that in many cases we already have laws that can be used to address the damage that is done by disinformation, which is one of the reasons why we're skeptical about fake news laws, because we don't really see in most cases an added value to what they would be correcting. That it's often about introducing a concept that is politically convenient, that serves the interests of those in power in most cases that we've seen so far. So, in cases where people are genuinely harmed by disinformation, often there is existing redress. So I think it's also important to look at what is the existing legal situation, and are there any gaps in terms of, people's rights, the rights of the public that are being potentially harmed by media. And if there are, we can discuss ways to address those. But, some kind of umbrella of fake news law is completely the wrong way to go, in our opinion. And should, I think, generate immediate scrutiny about what are the interests of those who are introducing these types of laws.
Yeah, and Scott, as you mentioned, I mean, there are criminal defamation laws in South Korea, which are actually quite controversial, but it's not as if there wasn't any redress for victims of defamation and things like that. In fact, South Korea, interestingly, is a country where the truth of the allegations is not a defense in a defamation case, which has caused a lot of controversy, especially during the Me Too, during the Me Too sort of allegations, when a lot of those were coming out. There was sort of a view here that since truth could not be a defense for defamation allegations, that perhaps this was sort of tipping the scales in favor of the alleged abuser in certain situations. So that is certainly an issue in South Korea as well. But yeah, it's a bit confusing, to be honest, why this particular law was even necessary, given the actual content of the law.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Scott,
exactly. So go ahead, David.
Forgive me, but do you know of other countries where truth is not a defense against defamation or libel?
Yeah, I mean, there are several other jurisdictions where truth is not a defense. In Europe, in many countries, truth is not a defense for defamation, because courts will consider the context in which the statement was made, and especially if you're talking about statements which are seen as infringing privacy or don't have a public interest value in the eye of the judge or the court that's considering the case. It's still, you may well end up with a defamation verdict, even though the statement was true, which was made by the journalist, which is a completely different approach to the issue that we find in the United States, for example, where truth is always a defense, or virtually always a defense. There are other differences in many jurisdictions. Again, this is quite different from the US, that it's often up to the burden lies on the media or the defendant, basically, to prove the truth of the statement, if truth is a defense, rather than the other way around, that the person who's suing for defamation needs to show, for example, the actual malice rule, that that the statement was made with reckless disregard for the truth. So that's what I'm saying. There are in many countries, South Korea included, there are too robust in many cases ways for people who claim that they were harmed by media coverage to bring those cases to court and to try to find some kind of redress.
William, have there been any high-profile cases of defamation and or libel in South Korea?
Actually, the previous South Korean presidential administration, Park Geun-hye, who was impeached, her administration was sort of infamous in that way for sort of, in the eyes of many journalists and many international rights groups, sort of abusing these defamation laws to silence critics. There was an intensification of the number of criminal defamation charges that were brought against critics of the Park administration. That is not so much a problem under the current administration, but I think that a lot of liberals in South Korea are still sort of very, very suspicious of that law being used sort of to silence critics. And once again, I mean, South Korea is not so far removed from a quite brutal authoritarian government. It's not so many decades since that existed. So these fears are very real, and I think valid in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Tell us, are there the media situation there in South Korea? Are there news organizations that are obviously biased to one side or the other? I mean, perhaps, some people in the States would say Fox News is biased to one side and CNN to the other. Is that same sort of situation going on there?
Oh yeah, for sure, especially among the newspapers. I mean, as I mentioned before, a lot of the biggest newspapers have a pretty explicit conservative bent. You find a lot of newspapers with an explicit liberal bent. And now things, I think, just like everywhere else, have been sort of shattered by social media. A lot of people are going to YouTube and just saying whatever they feel, because interestingly, after the 2017 impeachment of the Park administration, a lot of her older supporters just took to YouTube, interestingly, and they didn't trust the media anymore after they brought her down. And this is where they've gone to sort of have their own alternate information sources. And I don't know if that really is replicated anywhere else in the world. Maybe Scott can speak to that, where you have really mostly an older generation sort of gave up on traditional media. And really, I mean, if you go to a park or if you're on a bus, you can see people watching their YouTube streams, or in many cases, blogging. The protests are very, very common here. Very, very, very outspoken protests, and you'll see people with their nice South Korean cell phones doing video blogs from there. And of course, there's not much regulation there, and this fake news proposal wouldn't actually cover anything related to blogs or YouTube or anything like that. But that is increasingly the information source for conservatives. And then you have podcasts that a lot of people on the liberal side are actually more into these days as well.
Scott, are you seeing that elsewhere in the world where, in the States, I think most people would say that the older generation is the last to give up on the existing mass media?
Yeah, I suppose that is the normal, the usual situation, right? That it tends to be the younger population that is no longer interested in mainstream media outlets. So South Korea may be a fairly unique case in that respect, but I'm not completely sure. But I think that it's also true that we do see also in the US that certain segments of all age groups are drawn to news that reflects what they want to hear, essentially. So it may be slightly unique, but I don't think it's completely incredible or something that I wouldn't have heard before. I mean, we know that people now are more and more attracted to just hear what they want to hear and just receive content that reinforces their existing worldview. So in a way, it's not terribly surprising, I don't think.
William, let me ask this. In the United States, circulation of print newspapers in particular is dropping quite dramatically year after year. Are you seeing the same sort of thing in South Korea?
For sure. I mean, this is a very, very connected society. I think the percentage of South Korean citizens that have cell phones, and very nice cell phones, nice Samsung cell phones, is very high. And it is especially notable that many older people are actually very, very capable, in doing social media, especially YouTube. And they are sort of moving away from traditional media. However, there's not like any threat that a lot of these media are going away. A lot of them have links, as I mentioned, to some of the biggest corporations in South Korea. And I think they're, in some ways they're sustained economically by them. I don't think the media arms are probably the biggest parts of these large conglomerations, but they find it profitable to actually have them. But the dynamic is roughly similar, as Scott mentioned, to other places, although it has its unique South Korean dynamics, I would say.
Mm-hmm. What is the social media situation there? Is there an equivalent to Facebook, for example, that is especially popular? Is YouTube that?
So, it's not like there's necessarily like South Korean alternatives for Twitter. I mean, a lot of South Koreans are on Twitter. A lot of South Koreans are on YouTube and Facebook, of course. And that's where a lot of the conversation happens. Also on bulletin boards and things like that. They're still quite common. But, it's basically fitting along global trends, I would say, for the most part in South Korea in that way as well.
Do you have any idea the percentage of the population of South Korea that has internet access?
Oh my gosh, it's very high. I don't know the number right offhand, but the number of people that have smartphones is something like in the 90s, 90%. I mean, even upper 90s. I mean, it's very high. It's very, very connected.
I recall hearing the same thing even, 10 years ago when I was there. Mm-hmm. And what do you say, Scott, about, first of all, the circulation of newspapers in particular? Is print media dying in Europe?
Well, it depends very much on the country. In general, yes. Print media is declining in circulation all around the world. Some countries are slightly more conservative or slightly behind the curve. Here in Austria, for example, print media is stronger than it is or actually in German-speaking countries in general. Print media is stronger than other parts of Europe. There are fewer online media, but if you look at other countries like Spain, online media is much stronger. So that very much depends. But of course, in principle, yeah, we see a major decline, and we see different levels of online media and success with digital transition of traditional media, differing degrees of business, of new business models, and differing degrees of success. IPI has published a couple of reports, and particularly looking at local media and how they're managing this transition, not only in Europe and North America, but also in the global South as well, to understand, again, how these media are trying to maintain or grow their audiences as they transition from print to digital. And maybe just a comment on social media, because this is also a very connected to fake news, I think a very difficult issue when it comes to press freedom and free expression. We know that social media plays in many societies a destructive role. I think there's little question about that when it comes to disinformation or echo chambers, and also driving traffic away from quality media. On the other hand, we have a lot of countries where social media is the last place of resort for independent journalism. If you look at Turkey, or if you look at Russia, where mainstream media has been decimated or taken over by forces allied to the state, where it's difficult to find information, independent information, in the so-called media market. You need to go to social media for that. So it's also something that looks very, very different from country to country. In some cases, social media interferes with people's right to obtain quality information. In other countries, it's the only place where you can find independent information, which is, we also, fake news laws. We're also looking at a lot of new laws that are popping up about regulating social media. And we're faced with many of the same challenges. Something that may work in one country, or may be needed to address one problem, sets a very negative model for other countries that will use social media regulation laws to clamp down again on that last available space for free expression.
Fascinating. Dan, our technical guru, has found online the information that says South Korea's internet penetration is 96.5%. Dan, could you go ahead and look and see what it is in the United States, just for comparison purposes? William, so let me ask you about the atmosphere among the newspaper. Well, I'm sorry, I don't want to stick to newspapers here. Forgive me, but were people surprised? That is, journalists surprised that this law came along, and answer that part of the question first, please.
Yeah, they were. I think number one, I think the question is why now. South Koreans have, for a very long time, been highly skeptical of domestic media. I think a lot of global rankings sort of bear that out. But why now was a major question. It was a big surprise that this would happen right before a presidential election. I think that was a major reason why this got a lot of domestic attention here, was that, wait a minute, the ruling party is going to pass a fake news law months before the presidential election? That doesn't seem right. And just beyond that, why now, and why in this way? I mean, it didn't even really seem to fix some of the problems that we've been talking about structurally. It didn't really address those in any real way. Not that there's any easy answer to sort of address the problems of disinformation and misinformation on social media, but it really didn't impact. It didn't really do anything about that. It didn't really fix the issue related to the news portals, which sort of encourage sort of salacious, thinly sourced rumors and sort of shallow content. So yeah, I think many South Korean journalists were surprised. They didn't understand it. And it was sort of an open question whether this was sort of a clumsy attempt or just a nefarious attempt to fix the problem.
Yeah,
well, you mentioned earlier that there.
Sorry.
No, please go ahead, Scott.
That factored into our considerations as well. Why was this bill being proposed at this time, knowing that the presidential election was coming? And you can either say, as William suggests, that there were obviously some criticisms that maybe this was sort of a ham-handed effort to reduce critical media coverage at a sensitive time. But again, even if it was a genuine effort to address an existing problem, it's so important to have this public debate on this type of legislation, because the state has whatever interests it's trying to pursue with this law, which may be genuine or not genuine, but we need to look at what are the real life and long-term impacts of these types of laws on the media and its ability to do its job long-term, on the ability of the public to access information. So again, like understanding what is the context in which this is occurring and what impact could this have. This is how we always need to approach these types of bills, independently of the motivation of the state in introducing this type of legislation, I would say.
Well, this is probably the crux of the entire matter and the most difficult question to answer, but I feel I have to ask it. Obviously, we all agree that disinformation is a problem. Both of you agree with that. So how does a country try to control that without overstepping its bounds in terms of freedom of speech and or freedom of the press?
I just think it's really tricky, especially as it relates to when freedom of speech, especially on social media, is sort of attacking the democratic institutions that uphold sort of everything, right? I mean, in some ways, the situation in South Korea mirrors that of the United States, where during the pandemic, early on in the pandemic, South Korea had a legislative election, and sort of unexpectedly, the ruling party won a very, very just absolutely dominant majority in parliament. This is why they could pass this bill, because they have a very large legislative majority in the National Assembly. And what you saw after that was a lot of people, mostly on YouTube and social media, spreading rumors, frankly, that this was some sort of communist plot, that that China had somehow manipulated the ballot. There was never, as far as I can tell, any substance to that. People who actually looked at some of the theories, because some of them took on a more academic form, and you would look at them and you would evaluate them, and nobody really came to a conclusion that this was anything other than just seemingly political sort of attacks and disinformation. And I wouldn't say that a majority of people by a long shot doubted the results of the South Korean election, but it's at least a trend that's very worrying. And I think there's some similar trends in the United States. And what to do about that, I don't know. It's just sort of a chaotic time at the moment.
What do you think, Scott?
I think it's a difficult question, obviously, and I agree that there are issues with disinformation, misinformation that can be addressed. I mean, I think there are some approaches. Obviously, the long-term approach is education and media literacy and these types of things. But unfortunately, these are not things that you can apply quickly. And the problem that we see fundamentally is that, yes, I think there are examples in which disinformation is having a destructive impact on democratic institutions. If you look at the United States and Europe, on the other hand, we have a lot of countries around the world where the biggest producer of fake news is the government, and the biggest harassers of journalists is the state. And that is why we're very, very cautious about supporting or endorsing state-led efforts to regulate what you or me, or maybe not, consider to be fake news or disinformation, because it's a concept that is being weaponized by repressive regimes to control journalism that they don't want to see. So it's really like, because we work at a global level, we see the patterns that are taking place. We see the ways in which governments borrow from one another, copy one another, and when we talk about introducing disinformation laws or fake news laws in democracy, in what we would consider, healthy democracies with functioning rule of law, the knock-on impact of that, again, in these types of authoritarian regimes, which are looking for ways to justify their own fake news laws, which are not really fake news laws, but are about, preventing critical information from reaching the public, the knock-on impact is potentially very dangerous. So when we look at it from this global point of view, we see a few good answers that come up, but mostly a lot of bad answers to how to approach this problem. And it's sort of our role to try to stop the bad answers from becoming law and policy. And again, I do think that in many cases, we have existing tools to deal with I'm not saying that we have all the tools, because I agree it is a widespread issue, but we do have in many cases a lot of tools to deal with these issues. I mean, even if you look in the US, we'll see how defamation law changes. We know that there is this case involving Alex Jones, for example, whether his comments about the Sandy Hook shootings amounted to defamation. There's been a default judgment in that case. Not endorsing the outcome, US defamation law is very robust when it comes to protecting free speech, which is a good thing. But again, in most jurisdictions, there are existing laws that could be used to redress some of the harm done by disinformation. So it's a very complex issue, and one in our view that needs to be considered in the global context.
Yeah, and I let me just jump in real quick. I totally agree with you that this is not always an issue of journalism or whether or not free speech should be restricted. That's not really the question in a lot of ways, or it's not really the answer in a lot of ways, right? I mean, as you said, just education efforts, things like that. Often this stuff is I feel like should be addressed at a much deeper level than just let's go get the fake news. That doesn't seem like the right approach here at all.
Thank you both. Our time grows short, I'm sorry to say, and we like to end these talks with the same question of each of our guests. And I would like to take about a minute each to tell us, what does press freedom mean to you? And perhaps, William, you will go first, please.
I don't even know if I'll take a minute, but I will say this. South Korea sort of reveals this dynamic that I'm going to talk about. Freedom of the press is often rowdy. It's often messy. It's not everything that we want. It's very uncomfortable at times, but it's something you need to protect. It's necessary, and any attempt to remove it or limit that freedom of speech is misguided, in my opinion.
Thank you. And Scott?
No, I would just jump off of that and say freedom of the press can be very messy. There are quality media and there are not quality media. But the opposite of freedom of the press is much worse than an unruly media landscape. And that's what guides our thinking as well when it comes to defending journalism around the world. We defend also cases where we definitely don't agree with journalistic approach taken or lack of journalistic approach taken, but the opposite situation is a much, much darker one.
Thank you very much. I want to thank both of you, in fact, for being with us tonight. It was an informative conversation for sure. The international community is working on a program for around December 15th, which will tie in the US Bill of Rights and international journalism. They're just waiting on some final confirmation of guests. January 11th in the new year, the IC will be hosting Brodie Fenlon, editor-in-chief at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and CBC digital news editor Andre Lau, to talk about the steps the CBC has taken to protect its journalists from online threats. You can get details for these and all upcoming events at the International Community website, and Dan has put that link in the chat window. You can also subscribe to the community's newsletter by sending an email to the IC. And again, Dan has just posted that in the chat window. You can also follow us on Facebook. Again, thank you, William and Scott and Dan, and thanks to all of you who have joined us tonight. Stay healthy, stay safe. So long.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
Thanks.